South Korea has widely been seen as an economic miracle thanks to its rapid development from the 1960s through to the present. It is today one of the largest and most advanced economies, not only in Asia, but anywhere in the world. It's home to globally competitive industries like shipbuilding, advanced manufacturing, finance, and automotive production, and it achieved all of this while maintaining a relatively low level of debt and while dealing with its rather belligerent estranged brother to the north. This economic success is one of the clearest examples of the virtues of market capitalism, democracy, and private enterprise over the alternative that's been playing out in North Korea, a nation which, despite having more resources and a direct connection to major allies, is far poorer than the South, which has not had those advantages. But the thing is that, sure, when compared to its most logical rival, North Korea, South Korea is the model of a diligently run economy, but when compared to basically any other advanced nation, it has some problems. Now, of course, the most current sign of these problems was the declaration of martial law and the subsequent impeachment trial that played out earlier this month. Those are some major events for a supposedly stable economy. But the reality is, these are just the most globally visible results of a country dealing with a lot of fundamental issues all at the same time. A country whose economic prosperity has perhaps been more of a manufactured exception rather than the natural result of whatever it did differently from the North. South Korea's economic miracle is probably less of a story about a miraculously well-run economy, and perhaps more of a miracle that things have stayed together this long. And to really see this, we as always need to look at a few key details. So, how did South Korea achieve its economic success despite having so many problems? Are these issues finally catching up with the country? And finally, how are these problems reinforced by the nation's precarious political dynamics? Have you ever had to make a presentation but dreaded the hours of work it takes? You know, formatting slides, finding the right images, and trying to make it all look good? It's time-consuming, frustrating, and honestly, kind of outdated. But what if you could create a presentation like this in just seconds? Gamma AI does just that. Let me show you. There are 3 ways to give input and generate a presentation. You can generate content with AI, paste in your own text, or import an existing file. All you have to do is describe what you need and Gamma does the rest. And that's how you get a beautifully engaging presentation with great content and visuals that's ready to present right away. The old-fashioned way of creating detailed PowerPoint slides is over. Gamma makes it fast and effortless. Here's an example. When we recently relaunched our channel Context Matters, we wanted to share the strategy, visuals, and channel focus with our team. Using Gamma, we created a quick, polished presentation that laid everything out clearly without spending hours designing it. I'll be honest, I didn't know what to expect when I first tried Gamma, but I'm quite impressed by how simple and powerful it is. So if you want to transform how you make presentations, check out Gamma today. It's free to get started, and trust me, you're gonna love it. It would be simple to say that the nation of South Korea as it exists today really got started in 1953 at the end of the Korean War, when the peninsula was divided between the communists in the north and the coalition of capitalists in the south. But there is a lot more to it than that. For starters, the war never really ended. The armistice allowed for the exchange of prisoners and the ceasefire that has continued to this day, but the two Koreas are still technically at war. But now that the "actually" comments have been silenced, the more tangible issue with this simplified history is that after the war came to a close, South Korea did not immediately become the shining beacon of democracy and the free market that it is today. It went through no less than 5 different governments, all broken up by coups, questionable elections, and authoritarian leaders, complete with military parades and cults of personality. If any of these governments managed to hold on to power for long enough to really cement their position, there's no reason to believe that the South would be any less of a dictatorship than the North. A lot of the economic policies of these authoritarian governments also didn't look that different, complete with 5-year plans and a strong focus on heavy industry. If the implementation of martial law seen earlier this month was actually fully put into effect, it would really just be a return to the historical normal for South Korea rather than something totally unprecedented. For a long time, North and South Korea looked incredibly similar, and the North was actually more productive thanks to their higher concentration of natural resources and their direct connection to the major powers of China and the USSR, which let them trade these resources directly over a land border. Now, despite all this turbulence, there were of course some differences that eventually resulted in South Korea becoming as wealthy as it is today, while North Korea effectively stagnated. The first big advantage that sometimes gets overlooked was that South Korea received a lot of aid from the USA, both in terms of capital transfers, but also military aid and technological know-how. Of course, this was all during the Cold War, where South Korea represented a convenient beachhead against the spread of communism, so they weren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, but either way, this was all a big boost to what was otherwise a relatively poor economy. Even to this day, the USA maintains a strong military presence in South Korea, with over 24,000 troops stationed there, falling only behind Japan and Germany in terms of foreign deployed personnel. This in itself is an indirect form of stimulus, as those men and women will be paid from the US Department of Defense, but will be spending at least some of their money in the Korean economy. and all of this is to say nothing of the billions of dollars paid to local contractors to keep these bases operational and provisioned. Now, to be fair, the US military is still getting a nice outpost in a geopolitically sensitive region, and Korea does cover some operational costs themselves, especially when it comes to cross-training their personnel, but ultimately it's also a nicely disguised form of foreign assistance. Now, the other big advantage that South Korea had over its problematic sibling in the north was that it did eventually liberalise, kicking off with the restoration of civil rights and properly fair elections, beginning in the late 1980s. With this, the people not only gained more economic freedom, but the country itself engaged more openly with the international community. The parallels between the opening of South Korea and the Chinese economies around the same time are frankly quite startling, and the only reason they aren't compared more often is probably simply because the Chinese story had a hammer and sickle, so it makes a more compelling story about how great embracing the free market is. Deng Xiaoping, the face of China's modern economic revolution, said that common prosperity would be achieved by letting some people get rich first. Now, in China, those people were perhaps, unsurprisingly, politically well-connected party leaders who benefited from the country's first privatised industries. In South Korea, the people that got rich first were the politically well-connected industrial families that owned the Chaebols. While companies like Hyundai, Samsung, LG, Lotte and Kumho have been private enterprises since their inception, they were hand-selected by the government to receive special protections and privileges. The hope was that these companies would help to rebuild domestic industry after the Korean War, and the government took an active hand in getting them the resources they needed to make that happen. This obviously made these companies and their families incredibly wealthy and politically influential, and many of them had more consistent power over the economy than the various governments that had come and gone over the past century. When South Korea fully started opening up to global commerce in the late 1980s, these companies expanded their operations and were very successful in making Korea an industrial powerhouse, but they also made themselves extremely wealthy in the process. The timing of Korea's liberalization was also something of a miracle as well. These companies had enough time to build up technical know-how, their labour force was still quite cheap and therefore globally competitive, and China was still almost a decade away from really becoming the workshop of the world, especially in the more technical industries that Korea came to dominate, like shipbuilding, electronics and automobiles. And as if their timing wasn't already serendipitous enough, just a few years earlier, the Plaza Accord was signed, which was an agreement between major Western nations and Japan to allow the value of the Japanese yen to rise in relation to the US dollar, and by extension these other currencies as well. This was done because Japanese exports had begun dominating the global market, and their artificially low-cost currency was helping them maintain what was seen as an unfair advantage. South Korea did not make the same agreements, so right as Japan lost its competitive edge, it was able to swoop in and undercut the Asian superpower, which at the time was already much richer and therefore more expensive to manufacture in. Now, Japanese low-cost exports losing ground to Korean low-cost exports, which have in turn lost ground to Chinese low-cost exports, is just the reality of globalization. Fortunately for Korea, it has managed to build out these industries that compete on world-leading technology, expertise and brand image rather than purely price. So it's managed to maintain and even grow its value-added manufacturing, but the bumpy ride it took to get there still has burdened the country with a long list of problems. The mega conglomerates of South Korea may have been an effective tool to push through industrial ambition, but they have effectively now become state-sanctioned monopolies, with all of the disadvantages of state-owned enterprises, combined with all of the disadvantages of private profit-at-all-cost companies. Now, the first typical problem with companies this large is that they have no real competition, so they can charge whatever they want at the expense of the consumer. The good news is that South Korea is a predominantly export-led economy, which means that the typical problems with monopolistic pricing are not really too much of a concern within the economy. The Chaebols also tend to be large conglomerates spreading their operations into multiple markets rather than dominating just one. Samsung may be best known as a technology company, but it also operates in finance, insurance, military production, and even shipbuilding, so while it is massive, it still has to compete across these operations, and of course it has global rivals to contend with as well. But there's actually an even bigger issue with the megacorporations that control the Korean economy. They may not have monopoly power over consumers, but they do over workers. These major global companies pay considerably better than smaller local business, so the competition to get a job with one of these companies is insane. People go through intense high school exams to get into top universities, and then do separate employment exams just to be considered for an interview at a company like LG, Samsung or Hyundai. Outside of becoming a medical doctor or a high-end lawyer, jobs at these companies are seen as one of the only ways to get ahead in an extremely competitive society. Now, apart from being a huge social issue, which we will need to discuss later, this industrial concentration has very immediate economic problems. If people spend their entire lives trying to land a job with one of these companies, then that means a lot of talent is being directed away from starting new businesses that could introduce new technologies. Beyond manpower, these chaebols also soak up a lot of capital. These organisations tend to run very debt-heavy to spread out into all of these very capital-intensive industries. Something like shipbuilding, one of the country's biggest industries, requires an enormous amount of money not only to construct the yards, but also to finance the ships themselves before they can be sold to their eventual buyer. Since these conglomerates are so large, they can access this money through loans quite easily, and since the financial sector just considers them too big to fail, they're happy to lend to them over small businesses. Government debt to GDP in South Korea is relatively low for an advanced economy, but corporate debt to GDP, primarily coming from these megacorporations, is amongst some of the highest levels in the world. Comparatively today, even China has a bigger culture of starting new businesses to produce new technologies, and a lot of these businesses have been highly successful. Another problem is that it means that the economy is not very well diversified. The revenue of Samsung Group alone was more than 22% of the country's total GDP in 2022. Now, this is often misrepresented to mean that Samsung is responsible for 20% of the country's entire economy, which is not really technically how GDP works. Revenue is just the total amount of money a company brings in top-line sales, where gross domestic product looks at actual value add. So theoretically, Samsung could have just sold a bunch of phones that it imported from China, made a lot of revenue, and actually had a negative impact on GDP since imports are subtracted from total output. An even sillier example is someone could make a business selling $20 bills for $10, sell a billion of them and claim revenues of $10 billion, while not really making any contributions towards economic productivity or running a particularly sustainable business. But with technicalities aside, Samsung is actually a huge exporter, a component of GDP, and their value add through manufacturing and services is quite a solid share of their total revenue. So while the 20% of the entire Korean economy claim is a bit of a stretch, it's still more than fair to say that they, and a small collection of other companies, don't just have an unreasonable influence over the Korean economy, they are the Korean economy. This has over time also created something of a bad culture with global partners as well. Because the Korean Chaebols are simply too big to fail, they get special treatment by the government, which makes it very hard for foreign companies to compete in their domestic market, which means big importers are far less motivated to make neutral trade agreements with Korea, and in such an export-heavy economy, this can be bad news. Following the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, the IMF actually put conditions on how the government could work with these companies going forward, and it had to agree to these conditions as part of their $60 billion bailout loan. Back then, that was actually a lot of money for financial bailouts. Now, the burden that these old, slow, and too big to fail corporations put on the Korean economy has been well documented, but unwinding their influence is next to impossible. Within the country, there is also a lot of popular support for these companies because they were seen as what made the nation as wealthy as it is today, which is not wrong. When an economy is poor, pushing through a few core industries like the ones conducted by these chaebols is a good way to create a solid foundation of jobs, exports, and business. South Korea was also quite lucky that the industries it decided to go all in on have done very well over the last 3 decades. Technology, and in particular smartphones, global shipping, and economy cars have all seen massive market growth. But eventually they need to compete fairly, otherwise they're just going to get slow and lazy. Korea is still competitive in all of these industries, but it's not dominant like it once was. They are starting to stagnate. Their population is aging, investors are weary about putting money into the country, and just like they became the new Japan, China is becoming the new Korea, making even cheaper cars, more exciting phones, and pouring billions back into making ships as well. Korea is now a high-income economy where people want to be paid a decent wage to compensate for higher costs of living. The scale and weight of these companies are also making all of these problems worse. The miracle on the Han River made South Korea what it is today, which is obviously still one of the most prosperous economies in the world, but there was a Faustian bargain made with these companies that means that, frankly, it was a miracle it lasted this long. Now, they do have one big advantage over their major competitors, and it's simply politics. For as crumbly as their industries are, the West, and in particular the USA, is a lot more interested in doing business with a strong ally as compared to a perceived adversary. Internally, it's a little bit more complicated though. Of course, the real reason these companies get such little scrutiny is simply their immense political influence. Now, they may have been able to get away with pulling the strings of power while their economy was on the up and up, but as it has stagnated, people have realised they're fighting over a pie that is no longer growing. Unfortunately for the country, that could mean the political instability we saw earlier this month is just a harbinger of what is to come as the country becomes divided on how to regain that greatness, which could in turn make all of these very real economic problems even worse. Now, we try to avoid politics here on this channel, but we've actually made a full video over on our partner channel Context Matters, where we explain the bizarre and perhaps dangerous political dynamics of South Korea. So yeah, make sure to subscribe to that channel if you're interested in those kinds of breakdowns, and you should be able to click to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.